Hello, hello, hello. We are going to do chapter 3 of The Divide. So, in the last chapter, we mapped out an answer to the question of whether or not poverty and hunger are actually improving in the way that the good news narrative claims that they are. And the reality of the statistics seems to be that, in fact, that's not true. And so in this chapter, we're going to be asking, okay, so poverty doesn't seem to be getting better, at least at any sort of appreciable rate. But where did it come from in the first place? What is it that brought us the present level of poverty that we have? So the answer to that question in your standard like Econ 101 lecture is something about the laws of comparative advantage, that some countries are good at some things and other countries are better at other things, and those natural advantages as they play out over time give you different levels of national wealth or national poverty, just naturally, that this is inherent to the natural advantages and disadvantages of each country. And that in combination with the prices of the free market that set wages and that set prices for commodities will give you this history of some countries getting ahead and others falling behind, and that this is what gives us then poorer countries having an abundance of labor that needs to be folded into a global system, and rich countries having an abundance of capital that can be used to invest in countries around the world. So this theory, modernization theory, in specific points to geography as being some of what has made certain countries wealthy. So being landlocked, for example, can be a major disadvantage to a country getting wealthier. Or in the case of the United Kingdom, having rich coal seams that could be tapped at the same moment that they then innovated the steam engine. That combination then was this natural, exciting thing that happened to make them really wealthy. So their natural resources in combination with their development of science and engineering that brought them a lot of exciting new industrial revolution advantages, and their natural hardworking culture, which is called the Protestant ethic, those all combine together to really shoot England and the United Kingdom more generally ahead in starting about the 1800s and onwards. And poor countries, by comparison, they may be too cold or too hot. And by being too hot, then they may have a lot of tropical diseases that keep them back. Or they may be too arid, so they don't really have good cropland and can't have a strong food source. Or they may not have oil, or they may be naturally oriented towards having a good time instead of working hard and earning more money and investing that money in a business. So the opposite of the Protestant ethic, which was an idea put forward by a sociologist called Max Weber to help explain why certain parts of Europe got so wealthy. So these kinds of explanations are often folded into this larger Econ 101 idea that there is a comparative advantage that puts some countries ahead and some countries behind. And as we talked about in the last chapter, this is thought of well within the metaphor of the race, that countries are not interfering with each other's national wealth. They are instead running their own race, and their own natural advantages or natural disadvantages will be what puts some of them ahead and some of them behind. So again, this is called modernization theory. I'm also calling it that on top of what he calls it in the book, the development paradigm. And really, it suggests that the way to fix the question of poverty is for poorer countries to take the culture and innovations of richer countries and adopt them and attempt to make themselves look like wealthier countries, and then that will solve their problems. So in the case of the race, run like they run, follow their schedule, their workout schedule, eat the things that they eat, and then that will help you look more like them as you try and race them. This will somehow bring national wealth to a more equitable standard. So modernization theory, as we talked about in the last chapter, thinks about the wealth of nations as being independent. So Guatemala's wealth vis-a-vis Switzerland's wealth, those don't have any connection with each other. Switzerland is wealthy in and of itself, and Guatemala is poor in and of itself, and there's no relationship between them. They're totally independent of each other. But if Guatemala wants to be wealthier, it should make itself look more like Switzerland and adopt Swiss legal standards and adopt Swiss bureaucratic institutions and democratic institutions and production values and production methods, so that Guatemala should end up looking more and more like Switzerland over time in order to become wealthier. This is a homogenizing process in which countries end up looking more and more like wealthy countries, those being largely countries in the West, in a process that is unilinear. So even if some countries are running slower than others, they will eventually catch up in this straight line that everybody has to run to get to where they want to go. That it's just one way that we're all headed, and that one way is all up. All of us, all of the countries are moving up together, even if we're doing it at different rates. So I'm going to try and show you a video clip of the theorist Hans Rosling, who was mentioned in both of the books that we read this semester, Humankind and also The Divide. And he has a TEDx talk that is really famous that says basically we've never lived in a better era for humans than today, that things are much better today than they ever were in the past. And as you watch in this video, his explanation of wealth and poverty and how we got to be where we are today, I want you to see if you can connect what I laid out as some of the elements of modernization theory with Hans Rosling's video. So write down what you notice, and this will show up in the quiz later on.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubble showed the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you have seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involves plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Okay, so what did you notice from those terms I gave you before to think about how they then apply to Hans Rosling's video? If you noticed, he did mention colonization briefly once, the colonized countries, but overall, it's noticeable that his story starts the world from 1810. But when did colonization begin? Colonization began in 1492. So by the time we get to the start of the world for him in 1810, we've already had hundreds of years of colonization and a massive change in wealth for some countries, particularly the UK and Holland, which he pointed out as being way ahead of others, and great harm done to many of the countries in his little corner that were of poor countries. Also note that even though he does mention colonialism, he is depicting wealth and the pathway towards getting healthier and wealthier as independent. He shows countries as separate bubbles that have their own path along that unilinear trajectory, always upwards, always towards healthier and wealthier, and in the same way as other countries. But he doesn't really talk about the way these countries are connected to each other and the ways in which the development of some is predicated on extraction from others, extraction of wealth, extraction of labor, and the capture of markets. So he's talking about these countries as if they were completely independent little bubbles. So you'll note also that his good news narrative of enthusiasm really does assume that poorer countries will be able to eventually catch up with richer countries, thinking about them as if they are just coming behind in a race, as it were. So if you think about how to tell the story of global wealth and poverty, this is the way that definitely conforms to modernization theory, but it doesn't really take into account the entirety of the story of global wealth and poverty, or really understand the complexities of the relationships between countries that gives us a better, more reality-based model for how things actually work. Okay, so in chapter 3, there are terms that I want you to be able to use going forward in the exam. Some of these are terms we have touched upon already, and others are terms you will hear again going forward. But these are the terms of this particular chapter. The commons. This is a term that we encountered in our first book, Humankind. Subsistence farming versus capitalist farming. So what are these two different ways of interacting with the environment in an agricultural way? Enclosures, improvement, wage labor, previous and primitive accumulation, windfall wealth, mass markets, industrialization, an ecological windfall. Also, he calls this ghost acres in this chapter. De-development, as opposed to that unilinear forward motion, de-development. Forced market integration, captive market, unequal trade, reparations, dependency, core and peripheral relations, and the world system. So make sure that you are able to define and use these terms. All right, so as you know, Europe has not always been wealthier than the rest of the world. We touched on this a bit before, but life expectancy and overall health in Europe in 1500 were worse than they were in parts of Asia and parts of Latin America. So we talked in the beginning of the semester about the transition away from hunter-gatherer lifestyles into an agrarian lifestyle, and the ways in which agrarian lifestyles, by concentrating humans and by making us dependent on a narrower range of food supplies, really diminished our health, because it brought us a lot more diseases and it brought us much worse nutrition, all the while we worked harder for that life as farmers. So that's the picture that we're getting in 1500, is that human lifespan and human lifestyle that was much worse than hunter-gatherers. So for peasants in Latin America who were largely farming dependent as opposed to hunter-gatherers, or agrarian communities in Asia as opposed to hunter-gatherers, they had low life expectancy and health like Europe, but not as bad as Europe. So they actually had better sanitation than Europe did, and better medical systems, and as a result they had lower diseases and they had better nutrition. And technologically speaking, in the 1700s, Asia had far better transportation systems. They made better ships, particularly India had some of the best ship making. India was famous for its steel, Damascus steel, which you may know about if you're into knives. Damascus steel was developed in India and spread to much of the rest of Central Asia. That was a technique that was known only in certain regions. Textiles were much finer, silks and muslins in China and in India. And there was much higher quality porcelain, which is why we call China China, right? Because it came from China. So the things that Europeans wanted, by and large, were of higher quality in Asia. And that, in combination with the desire for spices, really is what took them into the shipping systems that were attempting to bring back the goods from elsewhere that were not available in Europe. So technology and also food supplies were better elsewhere than in Europe. And business methods as well in China and India, in combination with their trade routes, made them much wealthier. So that in 1500, India and China combined controlled 62% of the total GDP, gross domestic product, in the world, whereas Europe controlled 15%. So at one point in time, it was Europe that was behind, and China and India that were far ahead technologically and in terms of total wealth, but also in terms of life expectancy and health. So then how did that change? How did we get the system that we have today? The capitalist system that we have today is not the same thing as markets writ large. So trade and trade for interest and loans for interest, these have existed in economic systems throughout human history. Various forms of trade have. But the specifics of what we call capitalism are not the same as what we could think of as a free market, which is letting anyone trade whatever they want for whatever they want. Capitalism specifically requires three things in order to get it going in the way that we live it today, which is through the wage labor systems that most of us are employed through today. So capitalism requires what Adam Smith and Karl Marx called previous or primitive accumulation, which is somebody has to have enough concentrated capital to be able to start up a capitalist enterprise. So you have to have previous accumulation of wealth. So you have to have that wealth, but that has to then combine with available labor that wealth can employ in a way that it can then produce profit out of the combination of wealth previously accumulated and labor. So how do you get people to work for wages? It's actually a big mystery if you think about what human life was like in agrarian times, and especially in hunter-gathering times, right? That what humans were used to doing with themselves in order to subsist, in order to have what they would consider a good life, was enough that they would not need to sell their labor to someone else. So for the capitalist system to work, how do you get people who are willing to sell their labor in the first place? Then the third thing that it needs is, once you have the capital accumulated to be able to invest in wage labor, and you have the people who are willing to sell their labor to the capitalists, then with the things that you produce through that combination, you need somebody who is interested in buying the products that you produce in the first place. So you have to have a ready market for your products, in which case you have to have people who need to buy things. So how do you get these three things together in order to get all of the components necessary for building the current economic system that we have in the globe today? So the way that Europe started with its previous accumulation, or primitive accumulation as Marx would call it, the windfall wealth that powered the revolution came out of the forced labor in the Americas that was initially focused on extracting gold. So the first thing that Columbus really wanted the people that he enslaved to bring to him was gold, and that thirst for gold and silver then extended out of the Caribbean, where Columbus first was, into Mexico, where Cortez came, and then down into Latin America as well, when silver was discovered in Potosi in Bolivia, and then ultimately in the gold mines of Brazil as well. So a real focus on extracting gold and silver in the Americas brought out what became the initial windfall wealth that became the previous accumulation that enabled the capitalist industrial revolution. So gold and silver from the Americas. What did that look like in terms of actual numbers? So by 1660, the Spanish had extracted 16 million kilograms of silver and 185,000 kilograms of gold. That went up in the 1800s to 100 million kilograms of silver, mostly from Potosi, but also from places in Mexico and up into Western United States. So if these millions and millions of kilograms of silver and gold that were extracted from the Americas, if they had in 1800 been invested at a small interest rate of 5%, which is in terms of global wealth growth over the years, that's about on par. Then if you were to invest it in 1800, today it would be worth $165 trillion. So that is the kind of initial wealth that was pulled together and invested in Europe through the enslaved labor in the Americas. And although it was largely the Spanish that extracted this wealth initially, also the Portuguese a little bit, but mostly the Spanish, that money that they sent back, Spanish galleons, Spanish gold on ships back to Europe, was largely used to pay bankers and creditors in Northern Europe, particularly in Holland, the Netherlands, and in England. And England and Holland then consolidated this wealth together through marriages, through converging their banking systems in the 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries in ways that meant that that's what put the UK and Holland ahead, is that they had, through banking, they had largely been able to consolidate Spanish and Portuguese access to American gold and silver. So we have primitive accumulation going with that massive windfall wealth of gold and silver from the Americas. Next up, labor. How do you get people to work for you if they have a good life just living in their agrarian society or their hunter-gathering society? Why would they want to come and work for you on your plantation or in your factory? These initial capitalist formations that produced wealth efficiently for the landowners and for the factory owners. So obviously, as I already mentioned a minute ago, the initial way to do this was through slavery, enslaving indigenous people in Latin America, but then bringing over enslaved people from Africa as well in millions and millions of people. So it was in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 million people that were captured in Africa and were brought to the New World to act as free labor. And in the US alone, which of course slavery in the United States was not exceptional, in Brazil or in the Caribbean, slavery was as brutal and as extensive as it was in the southern United States. But if we just take the worth of the free labor that the United States got from enslaved people, that would today, if it were invested and got a small return on that investment, it would be worth $97 trillion today. So if the people who had done that work had retained the value of that work to themselves and had kept it all these years and passed it on to their children and been able to build generational wealth with it. Its worth today is $97 trillion in just the United States, not to mention the rest of where slavery was a massive system, economic system in the Americas, Caribbean, Brazil, etc. But slave labor is not the only part of the story of how we got to the global economic system that we have today. In Europe itself, there was a related, not nowhere near as brutal of a process, but a related process of creating low-cost laborers that had to take place. Because again, if you think about what it was like to live in a place like Europe prior to the Industrial Revolution, you, as a peasant, would go out and fish. You would graze your sheep or your goats or your cattle on the land that was around you. You would go into the forest for wood. You would go into the peat bog for peat to burn. You had access to the natural world around you in the form of the commons. So forests and waterways and peat bogs and grasslands that you shared with other peasants around you. And this was the agrarian lifestyle that had come after hunter-gatherer society. And there was private property involved to some extent, but there was still this ongoing sharing of common land that made for a certain amount of freedom, but it also made for a diverse form of subsistence. So you drew from a variety of resources around you. You had a variety of skills, and by and large, your time was your own to determine how you wanted to spend it. So if you had a life like that, would you want to go and work in a factory? And the factories that initially got started, people were working 6 days a week, sometimes 7, but 6 days a week, and usually working 12 to 14 hours a day, doing repetitive labor in a small cramped space, rather than ranging over forests and grasslands and waterlands to make your everyday life happen. So how was it then that England, that was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, how was it that they got workers for their factories? There was a long history of what is called enclosures in England and Wales and Scotland, and then later in Northern Ireland. And the enclosure system, which happened over hundreds of years, was this slow, steady process, largely involved landowners taking over the common areas, literally enclosing them with walls and disallowing the people who had used that land for generations to come and do their natural things on it, like graze their livestock, or to access the wood in a forest, or to fish in streams anymore. So it was a long process of literally pushing people off their land. They actually would tear down their houses, sometimes burn their houses, and push them off their land, and then enclose the land so that people who had traditionally accessed that land no longer could. So this process not only created great wealth for the landowners, largely focused on the wool industry and grazing sheep at this point, but what it also produced was people who had to compete with each other in order to make a living with their land under the gaze of the landowners. So the farmers who worked under landowners, in order to retain land, they had to prove that they could beat the person next to them and create more wealth for the landowner. So they moved from a form of diverse subsistence farming that was oriented towards meeting the needs of the people who were doing the farming to instead a form of capitalist farming in which what they were attempting to do was create profit for the landowner in a competition between farmers, so that a farmer who produced less would be plucked out and that farmer's land would be given to the farmer who had done better work under the eyes of the landowner. So it brought an element of competition into farming, and it reoriented farming to profit rather than to subsistence. And that was called improvement. So competition and profit-based farming was improvement in the history of England. And the British then went and imposed the same system in North America, saying that land that they worked on was therefore their land and could be enclosed and made private property, even though it had obviously been for millennia land that Native Americans had used and shared together. The process of enclosures started in North America with the English, who said this was a way to improve and to rightfully lay claim to God's land. In Ireland, it's this very system of enclosures and improvement that constantly pushed the Irish off of their own land and gave their land largely to English farmers who came in to do the competition and improvement. And that's actually what ended up causing the Irish potato famines of the 1800s that killed 10% of the Irish population and sent most of the rest of the Irish to England or to Canada or the United States to try and make a living, because they were systematically pushed off their land through the enclosure system and then starved through the potato famine. So the enclosures, which again happened over a few hundred years, what they started to create was a group of people who had no access to land and therefore no way to subsist or survive except to sell their labor. And as this population grew in the urban centers, it met up with the rise of the factory system during the Industrial Revolution, and the people who'd been pushed off their land through enclosures then became the working poor in cities like Manchester and Birmingham and London. It became what capitalism needed in the form of low-wage labor. So this is how England got ahead in the Industrial Revolution, is not only through the windfall wealth that it took through Spanish gold and silver, but also its own population being deprived of the means of subsistence through enclosing the land, this long system of enclosures that created working poor that was then able to take wage labor where they had once just been peasants who were subsisting on whatever they could do for themselves on their own land. So in 1699, over 71% of the land in England was enclosed. Enclosures started in the 1500s, and so by 1700, about 71% of the land had become enclosed. So massive swaths of land were no longer available for the commons anymore. And the rural population in England and Wales declined from 65% of the total population in 1801 to 23% of the population in 1901. So this was this mass migration of people off the rural land and into the urban centers, and he calls them refugees in the book. These people who were now working for wage labor in the cities, they saw their work hours increase significantly. So as peasants in 1600, before the process of enclosures really got underway in a big way, they would work about 1,980 hours per year, a peasant would, whereas as factory laborers in 1850, as you see in these pictures, they were working from 3,200 to 35,000 hours a year. And if you think about There are 365 days in a year. They're working 3,500 hours per year. You can see that they're having almost no time off for themselves in a year under these new conditions of factory production. And not surprisingly, as peasants, their life expectancy had already gone down from what it had been as hunter-gatherers, subsistence hunter-gatherers, as they started to become sedentary peasant farmers. But their life expectancy went down even further as factory workers. It dropped from 38 years as peasants to an average of 15 years for an urban factory worker, because very few children survived to adulthood. So that dropped life expectancy to about an average of 15 years. In part because they were being worked so hard, they were so poorly paid that they had very little food. And on top of that, they were breathing in the coal dust that was powering these steam engines that, as you can see on their faces, was something that they were in every day and was ruining their lungs as well. So the rise of the Industrial Revolution that became the vanguard of the capitalist global system that we have today necessitated enclosures that then brought very low cost, almost slave-like labor in England itself, on top of the slavery that was going on in the Americas. Okay, so this system of enclosures started in the UK itself. It then moved to Ireland, and from there, then they took that same system to India when the British were able to make a conquest of India. And in India, like they had in back home, where they had taken a piece of land and they had focused that piece of land on only one thing, either sheep production or potato production or something else. In India, they largely focused on cash crops that they were not able to grow in England. So in particular, indigo to dye clothing, which could not grow in the UK, and poppies for opium, which could also not grow in the UK. So in India, like in the UK, peasant farmers had, for generations, they had done subsistence farming. A little of this, a little of that. Yes, you are planting some crops, but you're planting several crops, and you're also accessing things in the forests and in the streams and in the ponds, and you are bringing together a little bit of everything in order to do well for you and your family. But this is not about someone else's profit. This is about what you and your family need to get by. And it is more labor intensive than hunter-gathering was, but it's not that labor intensive compared to life as a factory worker. So when the British forced enclosures on India, they pushed vast swaths of people off the land. They gave the land to whoever could compete to get more production value of it, and they forced the farmers to produce what they told them to. So they forced them into growing only cash crops in certain regions like indigo, or in certain regions like opium, or in certain regions like cotton. So they would assign areas to production. What that meant was when the farmers were forced to produce only indigo in an area, and then there was a drought which made access to grain more unstable, then all the people who'd been forced to grow indigo couldn't eat the indigo. They had nothing to be able to buy either, and they didn't have their diversified forms of farming that would have allowed them to get by in a period of drought. So the system that the British imposed on India created waves of famines over and over again as El Niños hit the area. Now, India had known drought for generations, but its farming systems and its economy had adapted to waves of drought that allowed it to not have massive famines in the way that it did under the British. Not that famine had never been known, but there was nothing like the kinds of famines in India before the British came and imposed a system of enclosures and improvements that was focused on capitalist cash crops, capitalist farming, as opposed to subsistence farming. So you can see here in the middle a list of various famines from 1770, when the British first started to control most of India, all the way until 1943, which is just a few years before India got its independence. And you can see millions and millions and millions of people died under the imposed system of cash crop farming that the British insisted on in India with their system of what was called improvements. So by and large, and I'll mention this again on the slide in the future, the number of people who died through famines under the British in India is conservatively put at 29 million. But if you tally up this list here, you can see that a higher estimate is much more than the 29 million that conservative estimates provide. So you can see here that the British, you can see British in the corner with their lines of workers. So you have a sort of factory-like system being imposed under the logic of improvement on Indian workers. And similarly, the British did build factories for things like indigo in India. But all of this was owned, and therefore the profits went to the British who were controlling the system. So there was this mass flow of wealth that went up from India to Britain, not only through resource extraction, but also through labor extraction under this new system of enclosing the land and forcing people to work in the ways the British wanted them to. So notice that this is not something natural, right? So it's not that India had a history of famines because they just happen to be in a region that is famine-ridden. Rather, they were in an area that has regular droughts, but they had an adapted system that would allow them to get by and through those droughts. So the natural part of it had been overcome. The poverty came through the imposition of the British of a capitalist farming system that was not oriented towards the natural surrounds, but was oriented towards the profits of the British. So I like this quote from Michael Davis, the historian. "We are not dealing, in other words, with lands of famine, becalmed in stagnant backwaters of world history." This is how Winston Churchill talked about India. "But instead with the fate of tropical humanity at the precise moment when its labor and products were being dynamically conscripted into a London-centered world economy. Millions died, not outside the world system, but in the very process of being forcibly incorporated into its economic and political structures. They died in the golden age of liberal capitalism, that is, capitalism without controls on it." So in the process of creating our current global capitalist system, we conscripted millions of people and millions more died into their current roles in that global system. So when Enclosures as a system was taken by the British to their colonies in southern Africa, what that ended up looking like was only 7% of the land in the country being allowed for Black people. So Black people were literally cleared off the land, white farmers were brought in, and they were then allowed to create a form of capitalist farming where black laborers could come back and work for wage labor, but they themselves could not have subsistence farming or pastoralist lives of grazing their sheep and their goats or their cattle or hunter-gatherer lives, which all of those three things were very common in this area. Hunter-gatherer lives, pastoralist life where you are relying on your cattle and your livestock, and then agrarian lives. All of these were quite common. So the British came in, and the Afrikaners as well. They pushed out the black people who were subsisting on this land. They enclosed it, and they gave tiny portions of land to the black people and said, you can live there. Everything else is enclosed. You cannot come except as laborers, giving for wage labor. So again, creating that capitalist form of farming rather than subsistence. So by the 60s and 70s, South Africa created what were called homelands where the blacks must live, and this is a map of what those homelands look like. So the ongoing logic of enclosures: this is our land, that is for you, we get all of the profit from this, you can have these small pieces. That was what the homeland system under apartheid looked like. So it was an extension of that enclosure system that started in England. Okay, so a reminder, what do we need in order to create our current capitalist world economy, moving away from an agrarian system to our present system in which I am not a farmer. I don't know if any of you are farmers, perhaps some of you are, but most of us are not. So how do we move from most of us being involved in an agrarian lifestyle to most of us now having to go and get a job for wages? Where did we get this system from? What are the things that we need? We need, first of all, people who are willing to sell their labor. Willing in the sense that they have no other option. Then you need people who have enough money to be able to employ those people for wages. And then you need the creation of a market. You need people to buy your goods. So how did we get that? All right, so drilling down on these various things that are necessary for creating the capitalist world system, we know that Britain forced millions Europeans together, forced millions of terrorized and enslaved indigenous people in Latin America and Africans into forced slavery or forced forms of labor on a scale that had never been seen before in history. So it's not that slavery had never existed before, but it was never as complete and as harsh and as totalizing and as massive, the scale of it being as massive as it was under European slavery. So yes, slavery has existed in other societies and in other points in time. European slavery is not the only version, but it was the biggest version and the version that is focused on capitalist sale in a way that never existed before. So that's a major aspect of how we got our current world system reliant on wage labor. Next, we had that windfall wealth of massive quantities of gold and silver from Latin America through that forced labor. Then we had the enclosures of peasant and communal lands in England, and in Wales, and then in Ireland and into Scotland, taking peasants off the land and forcing them to then become labor that could be conscripted into a wage labor system. And then creating a form of farming that is focused on cash crops. So it's focused on efficient profit production as opposed to creating a bounteous life, but a subsistence life more or less for the people who are engaged in it. So thinking about farming largely as a factory system itself, as opposed to thinking about farming as a way of life for oneself and one's family. So these plantation systems where you plant efficient monocrops, all one thing in one area, with the idea of extracting it to be sold in global markets, was first applied to the Americas in the form of sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton in the Americas, and then cotton especially in India. Cotton, indigo, and opium in India. So these plantation systems, which were basically factories for the land, employed wage labor. They required capital investment. they employed wage labor, but initially, most places they employed slave labor. So people dying in these plantations at very rapid rates. So that plantation system then got imposed. But also what came out of that then is you have entire areas that are focused on just cash crop production. They can't subsist anymore. And so then they turn themselves into a market for your goods. So if you have an area that's no longer producing everything that it needs, because instead it's focused on capitalist efficient production of cash crops, then you can sell those people everything else they need to subsist, and they become the start of your market system. So once you have the start of a market system, you then need market control. So the long history of trade and markets across Asia and the rest of the world was something that Europe needed to come to control and dominate. And they did that in part by determining who could produce what and for whom. So that, like I mentioned, indigo production in an area, or telling the Chinese what kind of grain to grow where. So controlling what's being produced, but then also controlling the markets themselves, and controlling that largely in the form of tariffs. So disallowing certain kinds of production in certain places, and then imposing tariffs that would keep down production in the areas that you want to control, and would boost production in your own factories back home, or in your plantations that you own elsewhere. So the British started to integrate the world system into their own hegemonic control of the world system through not only mandating what to produce across the world, but also putting tariffs in place to be able to then put their finger on the scale of cost in various places. And they did this by direct political control in these areas through military control. So Econ 101 says some countries are rich because they naturally have better advantages and others have disadvantages, and that prices and wages get naturally set by the free market, and that poor countries happen to have more labor and rich countries happen to have more capital, and this all comes out for the benefit of the world over time. None of this is true if you look at the history of how the world economy actually came into being. None of it had to do with natural free market processes around wages or prices. And none of it had to do with a particular comparative advantage of one country over another, except in the ability and desire and willingness to use brutal force. So that was the one comparative advantage that Britain, for example, had over India, is that it could mass produce guns in its factories at home in a way that allowed it to conquer India. So that's, I suppose you could call that a comparative advantage, but it's not a natural resource. It is instead, potentially you could call it cultural, or the happenstance of innovation around tools of destruction. But it's very different than the way that Econ 101 story tells it to be. So this system that got put in place over time then, as we know, set up a set of core countries and a set of peripheral countries. And the core countries are then through forced and enslaved labor and through colonial systems, they're able to extract out very low-cost goods through low-cost labor, but also they get to control what goods are produced around the world. Therefore, they're able to sell back their own higher-end goods that are at the cusp, the forefront of technological innovation, and that cusp is always changed over time, but they always control that edge, and then they are able to sell back those products to the countries that they control the markets in through direct colonial control, through tariffs, and as we'll learn in future chapters, in other ways going forward, so that we get this constant flow of wealth up to the core countries and extracting out of the peripheral countries in what is called a world system today, a world economy that is focused on the improving the wealth of the core nations, and that ever since colonialism got put into place, this process over time has seen the colonial nations get ever wealthier, even after technical colonization was over, even after independence was won, because the basics of the system of extraction and labor and plantation and natural resources versus high profit consumption goods is already established. Okay, run through these key components of how Britain gained what is called global hegemony. So in the world system, the first global hegemon was Holland, the Netherlands, and it was rapidly replaced by Britain, who through its global empire had a very long time, over 100 years, 150 years of massive empire. And it gained control of that massive empire first through controlling the transatlantic slave trade, which it nabbed from the Portuguese and the Dutch. So by, first of all, controlling the slave trade, Britain made its first step forward. And then enclosures in Britain and in Ireland created this working populace in urban centers that could be employed in factories. And then establishing the slave plantations, the capitalist farms, these factory farms on slave labor in the Caribbean, British Guyana, and North America, we got all of these cash crop systems that yielded massive profits for the people who owned the plantations in Britain. Then we got the factory system off the ground, which enabled that mass manufacture of guns, and also that was able to use the natural resources that were flowing in from places like India to be able to then surpass India, first by making India and China stop things like textile production, and then to sell back textiles where they had been ahead before, sell them back from the factories that are now being worked in by people who'd been pushed off the land through enclosures. So the creation of a massive market for these textile goods by deindustrializing India, not allowing them to produce their own textiles anymore, even though they had been ahead technologically before. Similarly with steel, they disallowed them from creating steel. Similarly with ships, they stopped them from making ships in order that they would buy steel made in England and buy ships made in England. This is not what you'd call a free market. This is a forced integration into a global system in which certain countries benefit and other countries are de-developed. They don't develop. And then England used Australia, New Zealand, and a lot of Southern Africa to send off a lot of the white working class people that were in the urban centers that were being upset about the working conditions in the factories. So there were repeated revolts happening in the UK, and in order to be able to deal with that, they shipped people off to these other places, Australia, New Zealand, in a way that kept greater peace in England itself. So that was an ongoing form of enclosures as well, by sending off people from the UK into the colonies. And then ultimately, when they outlawed slavery, they replaced it with what was called the coolie system, where they took workers largely from southern India and Sri Lanka, and they forced them to work around the world on the old plantations that had been worked by enslaved Africans. And then in Southern Africa, they did bring coolie work into Southern Africa, but they also created the apartheid system, which enabled more easy access to cheap labor, highly underpaid labor in Southern Africa. So this is this is the way in which the free market got developed, and the way in which Britain really rose to the top of that system. And as we know, as a consequence of their close ties with the United States and World War II, it was then the United States who took Britain's place as a global hegemon and became dominant in this pre-existing economic world order put in place through colonialism and slavery. So what was the cost of this system of colonialism and slavery? The numbers range a bit, but these are conservative numbers that I'm showing you here. So as I mentioned earlier, 12 to 15 million Africans were enslaved, and 1.2 to 2.4 died on the ships on the way to the colonies in the Americas. And many of those enslaved Africans lived very short lives when they arrived in places like Haiti's sugar plantations under the French. 50 to 100 million people in Latin America were living there in 1500. It's not quite certain what that number was like because we don't have we don't have many historical accounts of what Latin America was like before 1500 when Columbus landed, 1492. But we do know that by about 1600, there was only about 3.5 million people in all of Latin America. So anywhere from 50 to 95 million people in Latin America killed through the systems of enslavement that the Europeans, particularly Spanish and the Portuguese, brought to Latin America, but also through disease, a lot of it intentionally spread by Europeans to Latin Americans, but mass genocide of Latin Americans. And as I mentioned earlier, at least a minimum of 29 million Indians who died under British rule from famine, specifically. Other ways that Indians died under British rule as well. And there's at least 10 million Chinese who died under British rule from famines at the same time as one of the bigger Indian famines. And under the control of the Belgians, there were 10 million Congolese that died in 20 years that Leopold took over before 1900. So in just 20 years, 10 million Congolese dead. So these are just some of the numbers. Like the overall toll of colonization and slavery in the whole world is much higher than this. I'm not mentioning what the Dutch did to the Indonesians, or I mean the list can go on, what the French did to the Vietnamese. So these are just some of the tolls. So this is not just a toll in terms of what is lost to a people economically, although it is also that, but what is lost to a people in terms of the trauma that they then bear and sustain in their lives in having experienced this kind of loss. So slavery was outlawed in British colonies much earlier than it was in the United States. And when the British outlawed slavery in their colonies, they took about 40% of their national budget and they paid it, but they took loans to pay it to the people who were the enslavers, to the landowners in the plantation systems in British colonies. So rather than paying the enslaved people for their trauma and their labor and their health problems, they paid the slave owners instead. And the money that the British paid to the enslavers wasn't paid off until about 2015 in full. So taxpayer dollars in Britain until 2015 were still going to pay the families of former slave owners and totaled up, it was about 35 billion today that the families of slave owners were paid. And again, I mentioned just a few years ago that the British people, everyday taxpayers, were still paying money to the families of former slave owners. In France, when the Haitians revolted and won their independence from France, the French couldn't control the island anymore, but they could surround the island with boats to be able to force a negotiation, because the Haitians couldn't get their sugar and sell it. They couldn't get it off the island anymore as they were surrounded by French gunboats. And so the French, when they left Haiti, they forced the Haitians to agree to pay 150 million francs to buy their own bodies from the French. And so in order to pay that kind of money, the Haitians were forced to borrow from French banks at very high interest rates. And they were not able to pay off the debt that they took on to purchase their own bodies from the French until 1947. Again, France has not ever given money back to Haiti to pay for what they've done. Instead, they took money all the way up into 1947. So reparations has gone one way only. It's gone to slave owners. It's never gone to former enslaved people. In the United States as well, when we ended slavery at the end of the Civil War, General Sherman down south met with former enslaved people and asked what they wanted in the wake of the war, and they asked for 40 acres and a mule each, which he agreed to, 40 acres of land to be able to farm, and then a mule to be able to farm it with. So in recompense for hundreds of years of slavery, this was the small ask. And General Sherman agreed, but as you know, that was never given to the former slaves and the people, the children of former enslaved people in the United States. So there have been no reparations for this history of slavery. But Her Majesty's Treasury on Twitter in 2018 posted a rather tone-deaf, excited today's Friday fact that millions of you tax-paying Britons helped end the slave trade through your taxes, as opposed to noting that they had done nothing to pay off the families of former enslaved people, but instead, up until 2015, they were still paying the families of former slave owners. They admitted that on Twitter, and you can imagine it set off a firestorm that until 2015, taxpayers weren't quite aware that they were still paying former slave owner families in the UK. So we talked about what it was like initially in the early days, but by the time the United States took over as global hegemon from Britain, what did it look like, this global world economy that we had established? So it meant that colonialism was drawing wealth out of the colonies in a way that in 1820, so at the same time that Hans Rosling is saying the world started, the income gap between the richest and the poorest countries was about 3-1. And by the end of colonialism in the mid-19th century, the gap was 35-1. If you notice in Hans Rosling's dots, he does show that there's this growing gap between the wealthy and the poor countries. And that was the ongoing effect of colonialism. So India held 27% of the world's GDP before being colonized. It was a massive global economic powerhouse, technological powerhouse. And after colonization, it held 3 to 4% of the world's GDP. China held 35% of the world's GDP. And then after being colonized, it fell to 7% of the world's GDP. So the peripheral nations of the world, they lost $22 billion each year to unequal exchange through this process of sending out raw materials and buying back high profit consumer items. That's the unequal exchange that saw this constant flow of wealth upwards to Europe. And today, the periphery loses over $200 billion annually. So each year, the countries in the global south are sending $200 billion a year in profits to the global north. Okay, so that's it for chapter 3, the establishment of the global world system, how we got the wage laborers, the primitive accumulation, and the market system that became the foundation for the system as we know it today. That's the start of the story, and I will see you next time around.